I've been a trucker for almost 15 years now. This happened to me in 2017. I was driving an overnight haul through the Mojave Desert in California, heading to Arizona. I think I was delivering appliances, but I don't really remember. It was pitch black darkness all around me. The headlights on my semi were really dim, and I'd been putting off getting them fixed for a while. Usually I couldn't tell the difference, but since there were hardly any other cars on the road, it was much more noticeable. I remember straining my eyes every few minutes to make out the road ahead. That alone could have been a horror story by itself. I was debating whether to pull over for a couple of hours and wait for sunrise, but I didn't want to waste time. I desperately needed the money, so I kept driving, even though it wasn't really safe. I figured since it was basically a straight line, I'd be okay. I think it was about an hour before sunrise when I saw something approaching fast in the distance. Worried about hitting an animal, I slammed on the brakes. As my truck screeched to a stop, I realized what was in front of me, a car with its hazard lights on. The weird thing was that it was parked right in the middle of the road on the double yellow line. What was even weirder was that the passenger door was wide open. My truck stopped maybe a foot before hitting it. Not to brag, but I'm a pretty fearless guy, and I know how to handle myself in a bar fight. Because of this, I wasn't really scared when I saw the car. I was more curious than anything. I thought maybe someone needed a jump start or something, so I reversed the semi and pulled over. I thought about throwing down some flares, but decided against it since I hadn't seen another car on the road besides this one. I got out of my truck and walked over to the car. It was a warm, still night, and I remember thinking how strange it was that there was almost no wind. It was also really quiet. The faint click of the hazards was the only sound in what felt like the entire desert. As I got closer, I noticed that it was a new-looking red Ford Fusion. I approached the car cautiously. Like I said, the passenger door was wide open. I walked around the car and then stopped in my tracks. It was completely empty. I checked the back seat and everywhere else someone might be lying down, but there was literally no one inside. Suddenly, I was much less sure about the situation. I had expected someone to need help, maybe someone who took a nap in a really dumb spot, but I wasn't expecting this. The car was literally empty. I glanced over my shoulder a few times, feeling a lot more uneasy. I kept looking around in every direction. I felt like someone was going to charge at me or something. The problem was, it was so dark that I couldn't see far in front of me except for what was lit up by my truck's headlights. It was eerie. I waited a little longer, thinking about getting back in my truck and forgetting the whole thing. Someone was out there somewhere. Against my better judgment, I decided to keep investigating. I looked inside the car, but everything seemed completely normal. The key was even in the ignition, though the engine was off. I got out of the car and made my way to the trunk. I figured I might as well have a look. I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. I grabbed the key from the ignition and unlocked the trunk, but still, it wouldn't open. It was jammed from the inside somehow. I opened the back door and tried getting at the trunk through the back seat. To my surprise, it actually opened. There were 3 squished garbage bags back there, along with a rope that was tying the trunk closed. I glanced over my shoulder one more time before reaching for them. The coast was clear. I must have been within inches of one of the bags when the loudest gunshot I've ever heard rang out into the night. I slammed my head on the roof of the car in shock. I didn't even think. I just threw the keys on the front seat and got out of the car as fast as I could. As I was climbing into my semi, I heard a gruff voice yelling in the distance. He yelled, "Hey," a bunch of times, and his voice seemed to be quickly getting closer. I scrambled into the semi and turned it on. I threw it in gear as fast as I could. I remember cursing a bunch of times as the engine initially stalled, and that's when I saw him. As my truck began pulling out, I saw a person standing by the trunk of the car. It was a short, husky guy with red hair, wearing overalls and shin-high boots. In his left hand, he was holding a small shovel, but in his right hand was an old-looking hunting rifle. We locked eyes for a few seconds as my truck drove past him. He didn't move. I remember that he didn't look crazy or anything. He actually had a worried look on his face. As I passed him, he dropped his shovel and started waving his hands. He yelled, "Wait!" a few times, but there was no way I was going to stop. I drove away, watching in the rearview mirror as he ran after my truck for a few seconds before sprinting back to his car. It was clear he wanted me to stop, but there was absolutely no way I was going to do that. I stepped on it, pushing the semi much faster than I should have. I drove for about 5 minutes and started to think I was in the clear. But then, I saw headlights fast approaching behind me. I remember feeling more scared than I've ever felt in my life. I called the police and told them what happened as best as I could. That's when the car was practically right on my tail, honking like crazy at me. I honestly didn't know what to do, so I just kept driving, praying that he wouldn't try to ram me. After about 15 minutes of this, he cut in front of me and hit his brakes, forcing me to slow down. I was just about to crash into him when, finally, some flashing police lights appeared ahead. The Ford veered off to the right and sped into the desert, disappearing from sight. I pulled over and waited for the officer to show up. I frantically told him what had happened, but instead of chasing the guy down, the cop decided to take a report from me. I was so pissed. I told the cop twice that he could probably catch up to the guy if he left right then, but he told me not to worry, that they'd do a thorough search once backup arrived. He sent me on my way and said they'd call me if they ever had an update. They never did. None of my buddies have a story this crazy, and I've told it more times than I can count. I know what you're probably thinking. That guy was definitely burying bodies, but that doesn't explain why he had such a small shovel or why he tried to follow me. The bags in his trunk were also too small for that. Some of my buddies think he might have done some dismembering, but for my own sanity, I like to think he was burying some kind of animal, maybe putting a sick dog out of its misery or dealing with dangerous snakes. I really have no idea. Either way, I've never been totally comfortable driving through deserts late at night after this experience. I've been a trucker for over 2 decades now, and in that time, I've driven across every major highway and back road in the country. But the one stretch of road I'll never forget is Route 46 in New Mexico. I've tried to put the memory out of my mind, but it keeps coming back, especially on those long, lonely nights when I'm out on the road alone. It was the summer of 2009, and I was hauling a load of furniture from Las Vegas to Dallas. I'd been driving for hours, and the sun was starting to set. The desert was beginning to cool down, but the air was still thick with heat. I was exhausted and decided I needed to find a place to stop for the night. I hadn't planned on taking Route 46, but I was running behind schedule, and it seemed like a good way to shave off a few hours from my trip. Route 46 is one of those roads that seems to go on forever. There are no towns, no gas stations, nothing but miles of barren desert. The only signs of life are the occasional tumbleweed and the distant howl of a coyote. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the landscape was swallowed by darkness. The only light came from my truck's headlights, which barely seemed to pierce the blackness ahead. I was starting to regret my decision to take the shortcut when I saw a sign on the side of the road. It was old and weathered, the paint peeling off, but I could just make out the words, "Motel, 2 miles ahead." Relief washed over me. A place to rest, finally. I decided I'd pull in, get a few hours of sleep, and hit the road again before dawn. 2 miles later, I spotted the motel. It was a small, single-story building with a faded neon sign that flickered weakly. The sign read, "The Desert Oasis," though it looked like anything but. The parking lot was empty, and the building itself looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. But I was too tired to care. I parked my truck and walked up to the office. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and a small bell above the door jingled. Inside, the place was as shabby as the outside. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the carpet was worn and stained. Behind the counter sat an old man, his face hidden behind a newspaper. He didn't look up as I approached. "Excuse me," I said, my voice echoing in the empty room. The man slowly lowered the newspaper and looked at me with a pair of dull, lifeless eyes. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his clothes were faded and threadbare. He didn't say a word, just stared at me with an expression that was impossible to read. "I'd like a room for the night," I continued, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. The old man finally spoke, his voice raspy and barely above a whisper. "Room 9. Down the hall." He slid a rusty key across the counter without asking for any payment. I picked it up, trying not to touch his hand, which looked cold and clammy. I thanked him and made my way down the dimly lit hallway. The hallway was long and narrow, with doors on either side, each marked with a tarnished brass number. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic. I found room 9 at the very end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and the light inside flickered weakly, casting strange shadows on the walls. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. The room was small and bare, with just a bed, a nightstand, and a small, dusty television. The bed was made, but the sheets looked old and stained. I felt a chill in the air, despite the heat of the desert outside. The unease I'd felt earlier was growing stronger, but I was too tired to care. I locked the door, pulled off my boots, and lay down on the bed, hoping to get some rest. I must have dozed off, but I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was pitch black, the flickering light having gone out completely. I reached for the lamp on the nightstand, but it wouldn't turn on. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioner in the window, but even that seemed muffled, like I was hearing it through a wall. That's when I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound coming from the hallway. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, like someone was dragging their feet across the carpet. I lay there, frozen in place, listening as the footsteps stopped right outside my door. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, I heard the doorknob rattle, slowly at first, then more forcefully, like someone was trying to open it. My heart was racing now, every muscle in my body tense. I could feel the blood pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. The door didn't open, but the rattling stopped. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Maybe it was just the old man checking on the room, I thought, though I didn't believe it for a second. I waited, listening intently, but all was quiet. After what felt like an eternity, I decided to check the hallway. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could and crept to the door. I pressed my ear against it, listening, but there was nothing. I slowly turned the lock and opened the door a crack, just enough to peek out. The hallway was empty, but something was different. The air felt thicker, heavier, like a storm was about to break. And then I noticed the smell. It was the same metallic scent I'd noticed earlier, but now it was overwhelming, almost choking. I stepped out into the hallway, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. That's when I saw it. Down the hall near the office, there was a figure standing in the darkness. It was the old man, but something was wrong. He was standing perfectly still, facing away from me, his head slightly tilted to one side. His hands hung limply at his sides, and his clothes were even more tattered than before. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, unmoving. I took a step closer, but something inside me screamed to stop. The air around him seemed to shimmer, like heat rising off the pavement, but it was different, more menacing. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to fall into an abyss. And then, without warning, the old man turned around. His eyes were gone, replaced by empty, gaping sockets. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He just stared at me with that hollow gaze, his expression twisted into something that wasn't human. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned and ran back to my room, slamming the door behind me. I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Once the door was secured, I grabbed my keys and threw my boots on. I wasn't staying here another second. I burst out of the room and sprinted down the hallway, not daring to look back. The air was thick and suffocating, and the metallic smell was so strong it made me gag. As I reached the front door, I heard footsteps behind me. Fast, heavy footsteps, like someone was chasing me. I didn't stop to look. I threw open the door and bolted for my truck. I jumped into the cab and started the engine, my hands trembling so badly I could barely turn the key. As the engine roared to life, I looked back at the motel. The lights were flickering, and I could see shadows moving in the windows like figures dancing in the darkness. I slammed my foot on the accelerator and tore out of the parking lot, the tires kicking up dust as I sped down Route 46. I didn't stop, didn't look back, just drove as fast as I could until the sun finally started to rise. The desert landscape slowly came back to life, but the fear didn't leave me. When I finally reached the next town, I pulled into a truck stop and collapsed in my seat, my heart still racing. I tried to convince myself that it was just a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion, but deep down, I knew it was real. I later tried to find any record of the Desert Oasis Motel, but there was nothing, no mention of it anywhere, like it had never existed. I asked around, but no one had ever heard of it. The road was just another empty stretch of desert, with no sign that anything had ever been there. I've driven Route 46 a few times since then, but I've never seen the motel again. Still, every time I pass through that stretch of desert, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me, waiting for me to stop. And I know one thing for sure: I'll never spend another night on Route 46. I've been a long-haul trucker for nearly 20 years now, and in that time, I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road. But nothing compares to what I experienced in 2015 on a stretch of Route 46 in New Mexico. It's a story I've only shared with a few close friends because, honestly, I'm not sure if anyone else would believe it. I was driving a shipment of electronics from Texas to California, a route I'd taken dozens of times before. It was late September, and the nights were getting longer and colder. I had just crossed into New Mexico when I decided to take a shortcut through Route 46, a two-lane highway that cuts through miles of barren desert. It's a road that not many truckers use, mostly because it's so isolated, but I was running behind schedule and needed to make up some time. The night was as black as ink, with no moonlight to guide me. My headlights barely penetrated the darkness, casting long, thin shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the desert. The road was completely empty, not a single car in sight. I remember thinking how strange it was that I hadn't seen any other vehicles for hours, but I brushed it off as just another quiet night on the road. About an hour into my drive on Route 46, I noticed something odd in the distance. At first, it looked like a small animal darting across the road, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. It was a figure, a person, standing in the middle of the road. I slowed down, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch as my truck approached. As I got closer, I could make out more details. It was a woman dressed in a long, tattered white dress. Her hair was wild and tangled, obscuring her face. She just stood there, motionless, as if she were waiting for me. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the pavement, and came to a stop just a few feet from her. For a moment, we were both still, me in my truck, her in the middle of the road. I could feel my skin crawling, a sense of dread washing over me like cold water. Something wasn't right. I leaned out of the window and called out to her, asking if she needed help. But she didn't respond. She didn't even turn her head. She just stood there, staring at something off in the distance. I honked the horn, hoping to snap her out of whatever trance she was in, but she still didn't move. The silence was suffocating. All I could hear was the faint hum of my truck's engine and my own ragged breathing. I was torn between getting out to check on her and staying in the safety of my cab, but something deep inside me told me not to leave the truck. Then, without warning, she turned and walked off the road, disappearing into the darkness. It was as if she'd never been there at all. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Eventually, I convinced myself that it was just some lost hitchhiker, though I knew deep down that something was off. I put the truck back in gear and continued down the road, but the unease lingered. About 20 minutes later, I saw something up ahead again. This time, it wasn't a person. It was a building. A gas station, to be precise. I hadn't seen it on my GPS, but I was relieved to find some sign of civilization. The station was old, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1960s. There was a single pump out front and a flickering neon sign that read, "Gas and Snacks." I pulled in, hoping to top off my tank and maybe grab a cup of coffee to keep me awake. As I got out of the truck, I noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet. There were no cars parked outside, no sounds of life, not even the chirping of crickets. The place looked deserted. Still, I figured the attendant might be inside, so I headed toward the door. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, but no one came to greet me. The interior was just as old and worn as the exterior, with shelves lined with dusty cans of food and faded postcards. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a dim yellow light over everything. I walked up to the counter and rang the bell, but no one answered. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, like something rotting, but it grew stronger the longer I stood there. It was coming from the back of the store behind a door marked, "Employees Only." My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a look. I pushed open the door and was hit with a stench so strong it made my eyes water. The room was small, barely more than a closet, and it was filled with shelves of cleaning supplies and tools. But in the middle of the room, lying on the floor, was something that made my blood run cold. It was a body, a man, dressed in a gas station uniform. He looked like he'd been dead for days, his skin pale and bloated. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet, and ran out of the store as fast as I could. I jumped into my truck and floored it, not caring about the gas or the coffee anymore. My mind was racing, trying to process what I'd just seen. As I sped down the highway, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see that woman again or the gas station fading into the distance. But what I saw instead made my heart stop. In the distance, I could see headlights, but they weren't on the road. They were coming from behind me, from the direction of the gas station. At first, I thought it was just another car, but as the lights got closer, I realized there was no car attached to them. They were just floating there, like two glowing eyes chasing me through the night. I pressed down on the accelerator, pushing my truck to its limits, but the lights kept getting closer. They were almost on top of me when they suddenly vanished, leaving me in total darkness once again. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town, where I pulled into a well-lit truck stop and stayed in my cab until morning. I reported the body to the local police, but when they went to check the gas station, they told me there was nothing there. No body, no gas station, just an empty stretch of desert where Route 46 cuts through the middle of nowhere. To this day, I have no explanation for what I saw. Maybe it was a hallucination brought on by fatigue, or maybe it was something else, something not of this world. All I know is that I've never taken Route 46 again, and I've never driven through the desert at night without thinking about those floating lights and that eerie, empty gas station. I've seen a lot of strange things on the road, but nothing has ever shaken me the way that night did. Even now, years later, I can still see her, the woman in white standing in the middle of the road waiting for someone or something to come along.